The morning of July 12, 1993, broke crisp and clear over the dense canopy of the Absaroka-Bertooth Wilderness in Montana. A cool breeze, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, whispered through the canvas tents of Boy Scout Troop 114. 12-year-old Mikey Carver, however, was oblivious to the majestic beauty surrounding him. All he could feel was a nervous flutter in his stomach, a mixture of excitement and annoying unease. This was his first week-long camping trip without his family, a rite of passage he had eagerly anticipated for months. Yet, as he pulled on his stiff, new hiking boots, the familiar comfort of his suburban home in Billings felt a million miles away. His father, a former Eagle Scout himself, had beamed with pride while they packed his rucksack just days before. "You're going to have the time of your life, son," he'd said, his voice thick with nostalgia. "Just remember what I taught you. Stay with your troop, listen to your scoutmaster, and always respect the wilderness." Mikey had nodded enthusiastically, his heart swelling with the desire to make his dad proud. Now, surrounded by the boisterous energy of the other boys, a quiet current of homesickness pulled at him. He missed his mom's gentle goodnight kisses and the familiar weight of his dog sleeping at the foot of his bed. Scoutmaster John Harrington, a stern but well-respected man in his late 40s, blew a sharp whistle, cutting through the morning chatter. "All right, Scouts, listen up. Today, we're hiking to Glacier Lake. It's a challenging 6-mile trek, so I want everyone to stay hydrated and keep pace." His voice, accustomed to commanding attention, echoed through the small clearing. Mikey, ever the diligent scout, singed the straps of his backpack, the weight of his sleeping bag, canteen, and trail mix, a tangible reminder of the adventure ahead. He offered a tentative smile to his tentmate, a lanky, freckle-faced boy named Sam, who returned it with a confident grin. The initial leg of the hike was filled with the typical youthful exuberance of a dozen preteen boys. They pointed out animal tracks, skipped stones across a gurgling creek, and told ghost stories that lost their edge in the bright morning sun. Mikey, though naturally more reserved, found himself caught up in the camaraderie. He felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that had often eluded him in the chaotic hallways of his middle school. The rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravel trail and the shared laughter of his fellow scouts began to soothe his earlier anxieties. As the sun climbed higher, the trail grew steeper and more demanding. The initial chatter subsided, replaced by the labored breathing of the less experienced hikers. Mikey, smaller than most of the other boys, began to fall behind. A sharp pain bloomed in his side, and his new boots, which had felt so promising that morning, were now rubbing his heels. Raw, he paused for a moment, leaning against a towering ponderosa pine to catch his breath, watching as the gap between him and the rest of the troop widened. He called out, his voice thin and breathless, "Hey, guys, wait up." But his words were swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. A few of the boys glanced back, their faces impatient, before turning to follow Scoutmaster Harrington, who was already disappearing around a bend in the trail. A flicker of panic ignited in Mikey's chest. He took a long swig from his canteen, the lukewarm water doing little to quench his growing thirst or his mounting fear. He was alone. He tried to quicken his pace, his legs burning with the effort, but the trail seemed to mock him, stretching endlessly before him. The cheerful birdsong of the morning now sounded like a mournful dirge. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was a Boy Scout. He was supposed to be prepared, brave, but in that moment, all he felt was the crushing weight of his own vulnerability. A small boy lost in an immense and indifferent wilderness. The last confirmed sighting of Michael Carver was by a pair of day hikers who were descending the trail. They remembered his bright red bandana and the earnest look on his face as he asked them how much further it was to Glacier Lake. They told him he was about halfway there and encouraged him to keep going. They later reported to the authorities that he seemed tired but determined. They had no way of knowing that they were the last people to see him alive. When Scoutmaster Harrington and the rest of Troop 114 reached Glacier Lake, they celebrated their accomplishment with whoops and hollers, plunging their tired feet into the icy water. It wasn't until they began to set up for a lunch break that they realized Mikey was not among them. An initial, casual search of the immediate area yielded nothing. Annoyance quickly curdled into concern, and concern soon morphed into a cold, hard knot of dread. Michael Carver was missing. The sun, which had risen with such promise just hours before, now began its slow descent, casting long, menacing shadows across the rugged landscape. The Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, a place of breathtaking beauty, had transformed into a place of terrifying uncertainty. The search for Mikey Carver would begin in earnest as dusk fell, a frantic, desperate race against time. But the wilderness holds its secrets close, and for 22 long years, it would refuse to give up this one. The initial hours of the search for Michael Carver were a chaotic scramble fueled by adrenaline and a growing sense of panic. Scoutmaster Harrington, his face pale and etched with worry, radioed the local sheriff's department, his voice cracking with the strain of suppressed emotion. The remaining scouts, their earlier bravado evaporated, huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. The vast wilderness that had seemed so adventurous just that morning now felt like a predatory entity, its silence pregnant with unspoken threats. The chirping crickets and the mournful call of a distant owl seemed to mock their frantic efforts. That as night fell, the temperature in the mountains plummeted. A bone-chilling wind swept down from the higher peaks, rattling the branches of the pines, and carrying with it the scent of an approaching storm. The first search and rescue teams arrived, their powerful flashlights cutting cones of white through the inky blackness. They were a grim-faced assembly of sheriff's deputies, park rangers, and seasoned volunteers, their movements economical and purposeful. They brought with them a sense of order to the chaos, but even their expertise couldn't quell the rising tide of fear. Mikey's parents, Tom and Sarah Carver, arrived at the makeshift command post at the trailhead in the dead of night. They had driven the 2 hours from Billings in a state of numb disbelief, the frantic phone call from the sheriff's office replaying in their minds like a broken record. Sarah, her face ashen and her hands trembling, clutched a worn photograph of Mikey, his gap-toothed grin, a painful reminder of the vibrant life that was now in jeopardy. Tom, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, tried to project an aura of calm, but his eyes betrayed the terror that gripped his heart. The search intensified over the next few days, swelling to include hundreds of volunteers from the surrounding communities. They combed the rugged terrain on foot, on horseback, and in all-terrain vehicles. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their rotor blades thumping a relentless, rhythmic beat against the vast mountain silence. The searchers formed long, human chains, meticulously sweeping through dense thickets of willow and across treacherous scree fields. They called Mikey's name until their voices were raw, the sound swallowed by the immensity of the wilderness. Despite the monumental effort, the search yielded frustratingly little. A single, muddy footprint, believed to be Mikey's, was found near a creek bed about a mile from where he was last seen. A candy wrapper, the same brand his mother had packed in his rucksack, was discovered snagged on a thorny bush a short distance away. But these meager clues only deepened the mystery. They offered a tantalizing glimpse of Mikey's possible path, but provided no answers as to his ultimate fate. The emotional toll on the Carver family was immeasurable. Each passing day without news was a fresh wave of agony. Hope, a fragile and flickering candle in the storm of their grief, was repeatedly battered by the harsh winds of reality. Sarah would often be found sitting in their car at the trailhead, her gaze fixed on the unforgiving mountains, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. Tom, meanwhile, threw himself into the search, his face a mask of grim determination, his body fueled by a desperate paternal need to find his son. The media descended on the scene, their satellite trucks and news vans turning the quiet trailhead into a bustling hub of activity. Reporters, their faces a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine sympathy, interviewed the sheriff, the search and rescue coordinators, and, on occasion, the exhausted and emotionally frayed members of the Carver family. The story of the missing Boy Scout captured the nation's attention, a heart-wrenching tale of a summer adventure gone horribly wrong. As days turned into weeks, the search began to scale back. The initial surge of volunteers dwindled, forced to return to their jobs and their everyday lives. The helicopters, their fuel and flight time exhausted, departed one by one. The command post was dismantled, leaving behind only the trampled earth and the lingering scent of diesel fumes. The search for Michael Carver was not officially over, but the grim reality was that it had transitioned from a rescue mission to a recovery operation. The official search was finally called off after a month of fruitless effort. The sheriff, his face etched with a weary sadness, held a press conference. his words carefully chosen to convey both the immense effort that had been expended and the heartbreaking lack of resolution. He spoke of the unforgiving nature of the wilderness, of the countless hidden dangers that lurked within its majestic beauty. He offered his condolences to the Carver family, his words a hollow comfort in the face of their unimaginable loss. For Tom and Sarah Carver, the end of the official search was not an end to their own. They continued to return to the Absaroka-Bertooth wilderness on weekends and holidays, their solitary figures a familiar and poignant sight on the now infamous trail to Glacier Lake. They posted flyers with Mikey's picture in every small town and truck stop within a 100-mile radius. They hired private investigators and consulted with psychics, clinging to any and every sliver of hope, no matter how faint or far-fetched. The years that followed were a blur of grief and unanswered questions, a long, dark tunnel with no discernible end. The years following Mikey Carver's disappearance settled into a heavy, suffocating silence for his family. The initial flurry of media attention and community support inevitably faded, replaced by the quiet, personal agony of a loss without closure. The seasons turned in the Absaroka-Bertooth wilderness, blanketing the mountains in snow each winter, and bringing forth a riot of wildflowers each spring. But for Tom and Sarah Carver, time had effectively stopped on that dreadful July day in 1993. Their home, once filled with the boisterous energy of a 12-year-old boy, became a quiet shrine to his memory, his bedroom left untouched, a heartbreaking tableau of a life interrupted. Sarah Carver found herself adrift in a sea of grief. The simple act of getting out of bed each morning, a monumental effort, the sight of other children playing in the park, the sound of a school bus rumbling down their street, the glimpse of a Boy Scout uniform in a store window, each was a fresh and agonizing reminder of what she had lost. She withdrew from her friends and her hobbies, the world outside her front door feeling muted and colorless. Her conversations with Tom became strained, their shared grief a chasm between them that neither knew how to bridge. Tom Carver, on the other hand, channeled his grief into a restless, obsessive energy. He became an amateur expert on missing persons cases, his nights spent poring over books on survival skills, forensic science, and criminal psychology. He papered their garage with maps of the Absaroka-Bertooth wilderness, each one covered in a complex web of hand-drawn grids, notes, and colored pins marking areas that had been searched and areas he believed had been overlooked. His obsession became a source of both comfort and conflict, a way to feel close to Mikey and a constant, painful reminder of his absence. The other boys from Troop 114 grew up, their memories of that fateful camping trip fading with the passage of time. They went to college, got married, had children of their own. For most of them, the disappearance of Michael Carver became a distant, tragic footnote in the story of their youth. But for some, the memory lingered, a persistent, unsettling shadow. Sam, Mikey's tentmate, would occasionally have nightmares about the hike, waking up in a cold sweat with the image of Mikey's tired, anxious face seared into his mind. Scoutmaster John Harrington was a man haunted. The disappearance of a scout under his charge was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He was cleared of any official wrongdoing, the sheriff's investigation concluding that he had followed the standard protocols of the time. But the court of public opinion was less forgiving, and the whispers and accusations followed him for years. He eventually moved away from Billings, seeking anonymity in a new town. But he could never escape the ghost of the boy he had left behind. On the trail, the case of Michael Carver officially went cold. The thick manila folder containing the details of the investigation gathering dust on a shelf in the sheriff's department evidence room. New cases came and went, demanding the time and resources of the overworked deputies. The world moved on, but for the Carver family, there was no moving on. There was only the endless, agonizing cycle of hope and despair, of birthdays and holidays, marked by a painful, empty chair at the table. As the 20th anniversary of Mikey's disappearance approached, a local journalist decided to write a feature story on the case. The article, a poignant and well-researched piece, revisited the events of July 1993, interviewing the now retired sheriff, some of the original search and rescue volunteers, and, after much gentle persuasion, Tom and Sarah Carver. The story brought a brief, renewed flicker of public interest in the case, but it generated no new leads, no fresh insights, no answers to the questions that had plagued the Carver family for 2 decades. The journalist's article did, however, have one unintended consequence. It caught the eye of a young tech-savvy documentary filmmaker named Alex Preston. Alex, who had grown up in Montana and had a passion for unsolved mysteries, was captivated by the story of the missing Boy Scout. He saw in it not just a tragic tale of loss, but a compelling narrative about the enduring power of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. He began to formulate an idea for a new kind of documentary, one that would leverage the latest in technology to re-examine the case from a fresh perspective. Unbeknownst to the Carver family, a new chapter in their long and painful journey was about to begin. The seeds of a technological revolution were being sown, a revolution that would eventually find its way to the remote and rugged corners of the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. The silence that had enveloped the case for so long was about to be broken, not by a human voice, but by the high-pitched whine of a machine soaring high above the treetops. For 22 years, the mountains had held their secret. For 22 years, the Carver family had waited. They had endured the whispers of their neighbors, the well-meaning but ultimately hollow words of comfort from friends, and the crushing weight of their own unanswered questions. They had grown older, their hair streaked with gray, their faces etched with the deep lines of a grief that had become a part of their very being. But they had never given up hope, and soon their unwavering faith would be rewarded in a way they could never have imagined. Asterisk. In the spring of 2015, Alex Preston, the young documentary filmmaker, made the drive to Billings to meet with Tom and Sarah Carver. He was nervous, acutely aware of the delicate nature of his proposal and the deep well of pain he was about to disturb. He found them living in the same modest, single-story house they had occupied for over 30 years. The front yard, meticulously maintained, a testament to a life lived in quiet order despite the chaos that had appended their world. He was struck by the palpable sense of loss that seemed to permeate the very air inside their home. He began by expressing his sincere condolences, his voice soft and respectful. He spoke of how Mikey's story had moved him, how he had been captivated by their unwavering dedication to finding answers. He then carefully, methodically, laid out his plan. He explained the recent advancements in unmanned aerial vehicle technology, drones, as they were commonly known. He described how these small, remote-controlled aircraft, equipped with high-resolution cameras, could be used to systematically survey large, inaccessible areas of terrain with a level of detail that was previously unimaginable. Tom Carver listened intently, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a flicker of interest. He had spent countless hours poring over satellite images and topographical maps, but the technology Alex was describing was something else entirely. It offered the promise of a bird's-eye view, but with a level of precision that could potentially reveal clues that had been missed by both the human eye and the distant lens of a satellite. Sarah, however, remained guarded, her heart having been broken by too many false hopes over the years. Asterisk. Alex, sensing her hesitation, pulled out his laptop and showed them footage from a recent project he had worked on, a search for a missing hiker in the mountains of Colorado. The clarity of the images was astounding. He demonstrated how the drone could hover just feet above the ground, its camera capturing every rock, every fallen log, every subtle depression in the earth. He explained that the drone could be programmed to fly a predetermined grid pattern, ensuring that no inch of the search area was overlooked. "I can't promise you we'll find anything," Alex said, his gaze steady and sincere, "but I can promise you that we will look with a new kind of eye, in a way that has never been possible before." He explained that he had secured funding for the project from a production company that specialized in true crime documentaries, and that he had assembled a small, dedicated team of experienced drone pilots and data analysts. All he needed was their blessing. After a long, heavy silence, Tom turned to Sarah, his eyes asking a silent question. She looked at the photograph of Mikey on the mantelpiece, his smiling face a beacon of light in the dim room. She then looked at the hopeful, earnest face of the young man sitting across from them. For the first time in a long time, she felt a stirring of something other than grief. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it was there. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. And so, in the late summer of 2015, 22 years after Michael Carver vanished into the wilderness, a new search began. Alex Preston and his team set up a base camp at the same trailhead that had once been the epicenter of the frantic, desperate search in 1993. The atmosphere this time, however, was different. It was quieter, more focused, a mood of calm, scientific precision replacing the raw, emotional urgency of the past. The star of this search was not a legion of volunteers, but a sleek, quadcopter drone. Its carbon fiber frame and array of sensors, a stark contrast to the rugged, natural beauty of the surrounding landscape. The team began by focusing on the areas that Tom Carver, with his years of obsessive research, believed were the most likely to hold a clue. These were the treacherous, steep-sided ravines and the dense, almost impenetrable thickets of undergrowth that had been the most difficult to search on foot. The drone, with its ability to hover and maneuver in tight spaces, could now explore these areas with an unprecedented level of thoroughness. The drone pilot, a former Air Force technician with thousands of hours of flight time, skillfully guided the aircraft through the complex terrain. The high-resolution camera streamed a live feed to a bank of monitors in the team's mobile command center, a converted RV packed with sophisticated computer equipment. Alex, Tom, and a data analyst sat side by side, their eyes glued to the screens, watching as the wilderness slowly, painstakingly, revealed its secrets. The first few days of the new search were a frustrating exercise in patience. The drone captured thousands of stunningly detailed images, but none of them revealed anything of significance. They saw deer grazing in a high alpine meadow, a black bear and her cubs foraging for berries, the scattered, sun-bleached bones of an elk. It was a powerful and intimate glimpse into the life of the wilderness, but it brought them no closer to finding Mikey. The initial optimism began to wane, replaced by a familiar sense of disappointment. But Alex and his team were persistent. They meticulously reviewed every image, every frame of video, looking for anything that seemed out of place, anything that didn't belong in the natural landscape. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but they had the advantage of a powerful, technological magnet. And on the fourth day of the search, as the drone was making a slow, methodical pass over a remote, heavily wooded drainage basin about 2.5 miles from Glacier Lake, the data analyst suddenly sat bolt upright in his chair. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice sharp with excitement. "Go back, zoom in on that." The data analyst, a young man named Ben whose eyes were trained to spot irregularities in complex visual data, pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Right there," he said, his voice a hushed whisper of disbelief. "Among those rocks, just below that cluster of aspens, there's something there. Something that doesn't belong." The drone pilot, following his instructions, expertly maneuvered the aircraft back to the coordinates, the camera tilting and zooming with practiced precision. The image on the main monitor sharpened, resolving from a blur of greens and grays into a startlingly clear picture. Nestled in a tangle of fallen branches and half buried in a season's worth of pine needles and decaying leaves was a small, metallic object. It was glinting in the dappled sunlight, a tiny, man-made star in a sea of natural chaos. From the drone's high vantage point, it was impossible to tell exactly what it was, but its straight edges and unnatural, reflective surface were a stark anomaly in the organic, fractal patterns of the forest floor. A palpable tension filled the mobile command center, the low hum of the computer equipment suddenly seeming deafeningly loud. Tom Carver leaned forward, his face just inches from the screen, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had spent more than 2 decades imagining this moment, playing out 1,000 different scenarios in his mind. But the reality of it was more intense, more visceral than anything he could have prepared for. He felt a dizzying mix of hope and terror, a desperate yearning for an answer and a paralyzing fear of what that answer might be. Sarah, who had chosen to remain at the base camp, was immediately summoned. The team decided to send the drone in for a closer look, a risky maneuver given the density of the tree cover and the gusty crosswinds that funneled through the narrow ravine. The pilot, his face a mask of intense concentration, skillfully navigated the aircraft lower and lower, the sound of its worry blades echoing faintly through the live audio feed. The image on the screen grew larger and more detailed. With each passing second, the small metallic object was now clearly identifiable. It was a Boy Scout mess kit, the kind that had been standard issue in 1993. A collective gasp went through the small group gathered in the RV. Tom's breath hitched in his throat, and he reached out a hand to steady himself against the console, his knuckles white. It was a common enough item in a place frequented by Scout troops, but its location, so far off any established trail, and in such a rugged, inaccessible area, was highly unusual. And then they saw it. Lying just a few feet away from the mess kit, partially obscured by a patch of wild raspberry bushes, was a tattered scrap of fabric. It was red, faded by years of sun and rain, but unmistakably the color of the bandana Mikey had been wearing on the day he disappeared. The discovery sent a jolt of renewed energy through the team. This was it. This was the first tangible, physical evidence of Michael Carver's presence in this remote corner of the wilderness in 22 years. Alex Preston immediately contacted the local sheriff's department, his voice a mixture of professional calm and barely suppressed excitement. The case of the missing Boy Scout, dormant for more than 2 decades, was officially active again. A ground team was dispatched to the location, a slow and arduous trek that would take several hours. The wait was agonizing. Tom Carver paced restlessly outside the RV, his gaze fixed on the distant tree-covered slopes where the drone had made its discovery. He was a man on the brink of an answer he had both craved and dreaded for half of his life. Sarah sat in a camping chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Alex and his team monitored the drone, which hovered like a silent, patient sentinel high above the scene, its camera providing a live, bird's-eye view of the unfolding events. As the sun began to dip towards the western horizon, casting long, golden fingers of light across the landscape, the ground team finally reached the location. They moved with a slow, deliberate caution, their movements broadcast in real time to the anxious group watching on the monitors. They carefully cleared away the branches and debris around the mess kit and the tattered bandana, their gloved hands treating the items with the reverence of sacred relics. And then, as they gently brushed away a layer of impacted soil and leaves, they uncovered something else. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover warped and stained by years of exposure to the elements. The pages were fused together, a solid block of molded, water-damaged paper. But on the inside cover, protected from the worst of the decay, a name was still faintly visible, written in the slightly wobbly, cursive script of a 12-year-old boy. The name was Michael Carver. It was his diary. The discovery of the diary was a bombshell, a completely unexpected and potentially transformative development in the case. A mess kit and a bandana were evidence of Mikey's presence, but a diary was a window into his mind. It was a potential record of his final hours, his thoughts, his fears. It was a voice from the past, a silent testament waiting to be heard. The challenge now was to unlock its secrets, to carefully, painstakingly, separate the fused pages and decipher the faded ink within. For the first time in 22 years, the question was not just where Mikey had gone, but what had happened to him. Told, perhaps, in his own words, the drone had led them to this point, its unblinking, technological eye piercing through the veil of time and nature's indifference. But the rest of the journey would require a different kind of tool, a different kind of expertise. It would require the patient, delicate touch of a forensic document examiner, and the courage of a family bracing themselves for the story it might tell. The anomaly in the trees had become a beacon of hope, but it was a hope tinged with the cold, hard reality that the truth, when it finally came, might be more devastating than the long years of not knowing. The discovery of Michael Carver's diary sent a ripple of excitement and apprehension through everyone involved in the case. The small, waterlogged journal was carefully packaged and transported to the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula, where it was handed over to Dr. Alistair Finch, a forensic document examiner with a reputation for working miracles. Dr. Finch, a man in his late 60s, with a quiet, scholarly demeanor, understood the immense weight of expectation that rested on his shoulders. He knew that for the Carver family, this small, decaying object represented the last best hope for answers. The process of restoring the diary was a painstaking and delicate one. Dr. Finch and his team used a combination of low-humidity drying chambers, specialized chemical treatments, and cutting-edge imaging technology to slowly, carefully, separate the fused pages without destroying the fragile ink within. The work took weeks, each small victory, each successfully salvaged page, a testament to the team's skill and patience. Alex Preston and his film crew were granted limited access to document the process, capturing the quiet, intense drama unfolding in the sterile environment of the lab. Meanwhile, back in the Absaroka-Bertooth wilderness, the discovery of the diary and the other items had galvanized the search effort. the Sheriff's Department, using the location of the discovery as a new focal point, launched a fresh, more targeted search of the surrounding area. They brought in cadaver dogs, their highly trained noses capable of detecting the faintest scent of human remains, even after more than 2 decades. The drone continued its flights, mapping the terrain with ever-increasing detail, its data being cross-referenced with the old search maps from 1993. Tom and Sarah Carver waited in a state of suspended animation, their lives on hold as they awaited news from the crime lab. The discovery had dredged up all the raw, painful emotions of the early days, but this time it was different. This time, there was a tangible sense of forward momentum, a feeling that they were on the verge of a breakthrough. They spoke to Alex Preston Daly, his calm, steady presence a source of comfort and reassurance in the emotional storm. He had become more than just a filmmaker documenting their story. He had become a trusted ally, a partner in their long and arduous quest for the truth. Finally, after nearly a month of meticulous work, Dr. Finch called had managed to salvage a significant portion of the diary. Many of the pages were illegible, the ink washed away by years of moisture, but several entries, particularly from the final days, were surprisingly clear. He had transcribed them, and he was ready to share his findings. A meeting was arranged at the Sheriff's Department, a somber gathering of the key players in this long and tragic saga. Tom and Sarah Carver, Alex Preston, the current sheriff, and the lead detective on the newly reopened case, Dr. Finch, began by explaining the limitations of the evidence. The diary was not a complete record, and there were significant gaps, but what it did contain was a poignant and powerful account of a young boy's final adventure. The early entries were filled with the typical observations of a 12-year-old at summer camp, complaints about the food, descriptions of campfire songs, and excited, hopeful accounts of the hikes and activities he was looking forward to. The tone was one of youthful optimism, of a boy eager to prove himself. Then, the tone began to shift. In the entry dated July 11th, the day before the fateful hike to Glacier Lake, Mikey wrote about feeling homesick. He mentioned a disagreement with another boy in his troop and expressed a sense of anxiety about the difficult hike that lay ahead. "Sam says it's super hard," he wrote, his handwriting becoming slightly more cramped. "I hope I can keep up. I don't want Mr. Harrington to get mad at me. I want Dad to be proud." The words were a heartbreaking window into the young boy's state of mind, a poignant foreshadowing of the events to come. The most powerful and gut-wrenching entry was the final one. It was dated July 12th, the day he disappeared. It was written in a frantic, hurried scrawl, the pencil strokes deep and uneven, a clear indication of the author's distress. The entry was not a single, cohesive narrative, but a series of fragmented, disjointed thoughts, a stream of consciousness account of a boy lost and alone in the wilderness. He wrote about falling behind, about the trail disappearing, about being scared of the strange noises in the woods. Legs hurt, so thirsty. One line read, "Called for them but they didn't hear. Got to be brave. A good scout is always brave." He described seeing a large, dark animal that he thought might be a bear, and of scrambling down a steep, rocky embankment to hide. "Scraped my knee, ripped my pants. Mess kit fell. Can't find it." The words painted a terrifying picture of a young boy's struggle for survival, his training and his courage warring with his fear and his physical exhaustion. And then came the final, chilling sentence. It was written at the bottom of the page, the pencil lead broken from the force with which it was written. "Not alone," it read. "Man in the trees is watching me." The words hung in the air of the silent room, a ghost in the machine of the transcribed text. The implication was staggering. Mikey Carver had not simply gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. He had not been the victim of a tragic accident. He had encountered someone else in that remote, unforgiving wilderness. The revelation transformed the case in an instant. It was no longer a story about a missing person, a tragic tale of a summer adventure gone wrong. It was now a potential homicide investigation. The ghost in the machine of the diary had given the investigators their first real lead in 22 years. A shadowy, unidentified figure who had been there, in the woods, with Mikey in his final, terrifying moments. The search was no longer just for a body, it was for a killer. The final, chilling entry in Mikey Carver's diary, "Not alone. Man in the trees is watching me," sent a shockwave through the investigation, instantly reframing a 22-year-old tragedy. What had been presumed a heartbreaking, case of a lost hiker succumbing to the vast, indifferent wilderness was now potentially a homicide. Sheriff Jacobs, a man who had been a rookie deputy back in 1993, felt a renewed sense of urgency. This wasn't just about providing closure for the Carver family anymore. It was about finding justice for a 12-year-old boy. The man in the trees became the central phantom-like figure in the renewed inquiry. Investigators immediately began the daunting task of trying to identify this mysterious individual. They started by re-examining the original case files, looking for any mention of suspicious individuals or unusual activity in the Absaroka-Bertooth wilderness around the time of Mikey's disappearance. They pored over the witness statements from the original search, including the account from the 2 day hikers who were the last to see Mikey. Had they seen anyone else on the trail that day? Their initial statements mentioned only other hikers, in typical gear, but now every detail was scrutinized with fresh, suspicious eyes. The focus of the investigation turned to individuals who might have had a reason to be in that remote off-trail area. This included known poachers, illegal campers, and hermits who were rumored to live in the vast wilderness. Old law enforcement records were pulled from dusty archives, listing names of men who had been arrested for, or suspected of, poaching in the region during the early 1990s. Each name was a potential lead, a thread that needed to be pulled, no matter how frayed or tenuous it seemed after more than 2 decades. Alex Preston, the filmmaker, found his role shifting from that of a documentarian to an active participant in the investigation. His research for the film had led him to archived local news reports and community message boards from the time, resources the original investigators might have overlooked. He and his small team began digitally cross-referencing names, looking for connections for anyone with a history of violence or antisocial behavior who might have been in the area. The drone footage itself was reanalyzed, this time looking not just for human remains, but for any sign of a makeshift shelter or an old, forgotten campsite. The diary entry, while terrifying, was also maddeningly vague. Man in the trees provided no description, no details to help create a composite sketch or narrow down the pool of potential suspects. Was he a fellow hiker who had taken a sinister turn? A recluse living off the grid who felt his territory had been invaded? Or something else entirely? The ambiguity of the description left investigators with a wide, open field of possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. The forest, once a symbol of natural beauty, now seemed to hide a dark human secret. The news of the diary's contents was, for Tom and Sarah Carver, a new and complex form of torture. The idea that Mikey had simply been lost was a terrible burden to bear, but the thought that his final moments were filled with the terror of being stalked by another human being was almost unbearable. The grief they had carried for 22 years was now mingled with a cold, hard rage. The search for their son's remains became secondary to the hunt for the person responsible for his fate. Tom, in particular, became consumed with a burning desire for retribution. The investigators decided to re-interview Scoutmaster John Harrington. He was now in his late 60s, living a quiet, solitary life in a small town in neighboring Idaho. When the detectives arrived at his door, the color drained from his face. The ghost of Michael Carver had never left him, and the news that the boy may have been a victim of foul play seemed to visibly crush him. He cooperated fully, racking his memory for any detail, any forgotten encounter from that fateful trip. He couldn't recall seeing anyone who seemed out of place, but he admitted his focus had been on the group and the trail ahead. The detectives also tracked down and re-interviewed the surviving members of Boy Scout Troop 114, now men in their mid-30s. They struggled to recall the specific details of a camping trip from their childhood. Yet, under careful, patient questioning, a few fragmented memories began to surface. One of the men, Sam, Mikey's former tentmate, remembered something he had dismissed as unimportant at the time. On the morning of the hike, while he and Mikey were packing up, he had seen a flicker of movement in the trees at the edge of their campsite. He had thought it was a deer. He described seeing a man, partially obscured by the dense foliage, standing perfectly still, just watching them. He remembered feeling a brief, prickling sense of unease, but the moment was fleeting, quickly forgotten in the excitement of the day ahead. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone at the time. It was the kind of half-remembered detail that would have meant nothing 22 years ago, but now, filtered through the lens of Mikey's final, terrifying diary entry, it was a potentially crucial piece of the puzzle. The description Sam provided was vague: a tall man, wearing dark, earthy-toned clothing, with longish, unkempt hair. It wasn't much to go on, but it was more than they had before. It was a face, however shadowy, to put to the man in the trees. The investigators now had a new line of inquiry. Was there a connection between the man Sam saw at the campsite in the morning and the man Mikey saw in the ravine hours later? The possibility that Mikey had been watched, and perhaps even targeted, from the very beginning of that day cast a sinister new light on the entire tragedy. The testimony from Sam, Mikey's former tentmate, provided the first real crack of light in the dark mystery of the man in the trees. His hazy recollection of a figure watching the campsite was a fragile but vital thread. Investigators, led by the now obsessed Sheriff Jacobs, decided to focus their efforts on identifying loners, recluses, or individuals with a history of unsettling behavior who lived in or around the vast wilderness area in the early 1990s. They began the laborious process of sifting through old property records, census data, and local law enforcement files, creating a list of potential persons of interest. The name that kept surfacing was that of a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood had been a figure of local legend in the small communities bordering the Absaroka-Bertooth Wilderness, a Vietnam veteran who had returned from the war, a changed and deeply troubled man. He had retreated from society in the late 1970s, buying a small, isolated plot of land deep in the mountains, not far from the trail system that Troop 114 had used. He was known to be a skilled hunter and survivalist, living almost entirely off the grid. Reports from the time painted a picture of a man who was intensely private and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Hikers and hunters would occasionally catch a glimpse of him in the distance, a tall, gaunt figure who would melt back into the trees before any contact could be made. There were a few documented run-ins with law enforcement over the years, minor charges for poaching and trespassing, but nothing that suggested a capacity for the kind of violence that the investigators now suspected. He was seen as a strange, but ultimately harmless eccentric dot as the detectives dug deeper into Blackwood's past. A more disturbing portrait began to emerge. They uncovered military records that detailed a history of psychological trauma and disciplinary issues. They found reports from social workers who had attempted to make contact with him in the 1980s, only to be met with paranoid, rambling diatribes about government surveillance and the evils of modern society. He had, on several occasions, expressed a profound hatred for what he called the tamed and weak, people who treated the wilderness like a playground. The description of Silas Blackwood, tall, with long, unkempt hair, and a preference for dark, practical clothing, was a chilling match for the figure Sam had described seeing at the edge of the campsite. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, forming a disturbing but plausible narrative. Could Blackwood, a man who harbored a deep-seated resentment for outsiders, have been watching the Boy Scout troop, his anger and paranoia festering as he saw them as intruders in his solitary domain? The investigators knew they needed more than just a circumstantial connection. They needed physical evidence. The drone team, guided by the new information, began to focus their aerial surveys on the area around Blackwood's old property. Alex Preston, using his research skills, managed to locate the original plat map for the land, giving the drone pilot a precise set of coordinates. The land had been repossessed by the county for unpaid taxes in the late 1990s, and the small, dilapidated cabin Blackwood had lived in had reportedly been reclaimed by the wilderness. The drone footage revealed the skeletal remains of the cabin, its roof caved in and its walls choked with vines and overgrown vegetation. It was a ghost of a home, a testament to a life lived in isolation. The team then began to meticulously scan the surrounding land, looking for anything out of place, and then they found it. About 100 yards from the ruined cabin, hidden beneath a rocky overhang, the drone's camera picked up on a small, dark opening in the side of a hill. It looked like the entrance to a small cave or a root cellar. A ground team was dispatched immediately, their sense of anticipation palpable. They had to cut their way through a dense thicket of thorns and brush to reach the location. The opening was partially blocked by a large, flat stone that had been rolled in front of it, as if to conceal its existence. It took 2 deputies to move the stone, revealing a dark, musty-smelling interior. Inside, they found a small, man-made chamber, its walls reinforced with rotting timbers. It was clear that this had been Blackwood's private sanctuary, his final retreat from the world, and it was there, in the damp, oppressive darkness of the hidden cellar, that they found the echoes of Silas Blackwood's twisted life. The chamber was filled with a bizarre collection of objects, animal skulls, rusted traps, and stacks of old newspapers with headlines about war and societal collapse. And in a far corner, tucked away in a rotting wooden crate, they found a collection of small, personal items: a pocket knife, a silver belt buckle, a tarnished compass. It was a collection of trophies, souvenirs taken from the people he had encountered, and perhaps terrorized, in his self-imposed exile. At the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a small, silver object. It was a Boy Scout merit badge, the distinctive eagle emblem of the highest rank in scouting, and next to it, folded neatly, was a bright red bandana, faded with age but still instantly recognizable. A cold, heavy silence fell over the small group of deputies as they stared at the objects, the full, horrifying weight of their discovery settling upon them. They had not found Mikey Carver's remains, but they had found his ghost, a silent, damning testament to the fate he had met at the hands of the man in the trees. The investigators finally had their physical link. The bandana and the merit badge were the smoking gun, the undeniable proof that Silas Blackwood had not only encountered Michael Carver on that fateful day in 1993, but had taken souvenirs from him. The question of what had happened to Blackwood himself remained. The last official record of him was from 1997, when a hunter reported seeing him looking gaunt and unwell. It was widely believed that he had died in the wilderness. He had called home, his body never found. The search for justice had a name and a face, but the man himself was a ghost, an echo in the valley. The discovery of Mikey Carver's merit badge and bandana in Silas Blackwood's hidden cellar was a watershed moment. In the investigation, it was the concrete proof that had eluded law enforcement for 22 years. The undeniable link between the reclusive, paranoid veteran and the missing 12-year-old boy. The focus of the search now shifted with a laser-like intensity. They were no longer just looking for a missing person. They were searching for a clandestine grave, the final resting place of a young boy whose life had been stolen in the most brutal and senseless way imaginable. Sheriff Jacobs, his face a grim mask of determination, assembled a new, highly specialized team. It included forensic anthropologists from the State University, geologists with an expertise in soil disturbance, and a team of cadaver dogs that were among the best in the country. The search area was now tightly defined, a 2-square-mile grid, centered on Silas Blackwood's ruined cabin and the hidden cellar. Every inch of that ground would be scrutinized, every rock overturned, every subtle depression in the earth examined. Alex Preston's drone became an invaluable tool, its high-resolution cameras creating a detailed 3D map of the terrain that the ground teams used to plan their search patterns with meticulous precision. The work was slow, grueling, and emotionally taxing. The terrain was steep and unforgiving, the summer sun beating down on the searchers as they carefully sifted through soil and cleared away decades of accumulated forest debris. The drone hovered overhead, a silent, watchful eye, its presence a constant reminder of the technology that had brought them to this point. Tom Carver was a constant presence at the command post, his face etched with a mixture of hope and dread. He needed to know. He needed to bring his son home. Days turned into a week, and the initial optimism began to be tempered by the harsh reality of the task. The wilderness jealously guarded its secrets, and the passage of 22 years had done much to erase any signs of a hurried, clandestine burial. The cadaver dogs, despite their incredible abilities, were struggling. The scent they were searching for was faint, dissipated by time and the elements. But on the 8th day of the intensive search, one of the dogs, a German shepherd named Zeus, began to behave erratically. Zeus, who had been working a steep wooded hillside about a quarter of a mile east of Blackwood's cabin, suddenly became intensely focused on a small, relatively flat area of ground beneath a cluster of ancient, gnarled oak trees. He began to whine and paw at the earth, his body language a clear and unmistakable signal to his handler. The area was immediately cordoned off, and the forensic anthropology team was brought in. They began to carefully remove the top layer of soil, their movements slow and deliberate, like surgeons performing a delicate operation. As they scraped away the layers of earth and roots, a subtle change in the soil composition became apparent. The ground here was looser, the color and texture slightly different from the surrounding, undisturbed earth. It was the telltale sign of a pit that had been dug and then refilled. A heavy, somber silence fell over the team as they worked. The only sound the gentle scraping of their trowels and the whisper of the wind in the oak trees. And then, about 3 feet down, one of the trowels struck something hard. It was not a rock, it was a bone. The anthropologists, with an almost reverential care, began to brush away the surrounding soil, slowly, painstakingly, revealing what lay beneath. First, a small, slender femur, then, the delicate bones of a hand, and finally, a skull. It was a shallow grave, a crude and hurried attempt to conceal a terrible crime. And in the grave, alongside the skeletal remains, were the tattered remnants of a green Boy Scout uniform and a pair of worn high-top tennis shoes. There was no longer any doubt. After 22 long and agonizing years, they had found Michael Carver. The discovery was a moment of profound and gut-wrenching finality. The search was over. The years of uncertainty, of clinging to the faintest sliver of hope, had come to an end. For Tom and Sarah Carver, the news was a devastating blow, the confirmation of their worst fears. But it was also, in a strange and painful way, a relief. Their son was no longer lost. He had been found. They could finally bring him home, give him a proper burial, and begin the long, slow process of grieving a loss that was no longer ambiguous. The forensic examination of the remains confirmed the cause of death. Mikey had suffered a single, catastrophic blow to the back of the head, a wound consistent with being struck by a large, blunt object. The evidence suggested that he had been killed quickly, brutally, and without a struggle. The man in the trees had not just stalked him, he had ambushed him, his paranoia and rage exploding in a moment of shocking, senseless violence. The narrative of Mikey's final moments, pieced together from the diary, the trophies in the cellar, and the evidence in the grave, was a story of unimaginable terror. The mystery of what happened to Silas Blackwood himself was never definitively solved. The prevailing theory among investigators was that he had died of natural causes or exposure somewhere in the vast wilderness he called home, his body likely consumed by the very nature he both revered and feared. In a sense, the mountains had exacted their own form of justice. Swallowing the man who had violated their sanctity with such a heinous act, he had become another one of the wilderness's many secrets, a ghost who would forever haunt the valleys and ridges of the ABSA-ROKA-BEARTOOTH. Alex Preston. The conclusion of the search was the end of a long and emotional journey. His documentary, once a speculative exploration of a cold case, now had a powerful and definitive ending. He had set out to tell a story about a missing boy, and in the process, had become an instrument of justice. His drone, the catalyst that had finally unlocked a 22-year-old secret. The film would be a memorial, a testament not only to the tragedy of Michael Carver's death but also to the enduring love of his parents and the incredible power of technology to uncover the truth. The funeral for Michael Carver was held on a crisp autumn day. The sky, a brilliant, cloudless blue. The small church in Billings was filled to overflowing with family, friends, and members of the community who had followed the case for 22 years. There were faces in the crowd that Tom and Sarah Carver hadn't seen in decades, people who had been touched by their story and who had come to pay their final respects to the boy who had never had the chance to become a man. Alex Preston and his film crew were there, not as documentarians, but as guests, their cameras put away out of respect for the sanctity of the moment. The service was a poignant and heartbreaking tribute to a life cut tragically short. The pastor spoke of Mikey's infectious smile, his love of adventure, and his kind and gentle spirit. Sam, Mikey's childhood tentmate, now a father himself, delivered a tearful eulogy, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his friend's loyalty and the guilt he had carried for so many years. He spoke of the importance of not leaving anyone behind, a lesson learned in the most painful way imaginable. The Boy Scouts of America issued a formal apology to the Carver family, acknowledging the tragic failure of leadership that had contributed to Mikey's disappearance. Tom Carver stood before the congregation, his voice trembling but his resolve firm. He did not speak of anger or of vengeance. He spoke of love. He spoke of a son who had been a bright, shining light in their lives, a light that had been extinguished far too soon but whose memory would burn brightly forever. He thanked the law enforcement officers, the search and rescue volunteers, and Alex Preston and his team, acknowledging that without their dedication and the eye in the sky, they might never have known the truth. He spoke of the importance of closure, of the strange and painful peace that comes with knowing. After the service, a small procession made its way to the local cemetery. Mikey was laid to rest beneath a tall oak tree, his small gravestone etched with the Boy Scout oath and a simple, loving inscription, "Forever in our hearts." As Tom and Sarah stood by the grave, a sense of profound and weary finality washed over them. The long, agonizing journey was over. They had brought their son home. The questions that had haunted their every waking moment for 2 decades had finally been answered. The silence was no longer filled with the terrifying static of the unknown, but with the quiet, gentle hum of memory. In the months that followed, the Carver family began the slow and difficult process of rebuilding their lives. The gaping wound of Mikey's absence would never fully heal, but the raw, open agony of not knowing had been replaced by the dull, persistent ache of a scar. They established a foundation in Mikey's name, a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting wilderness safety, education for young people, and providing resources and support for the families of missing persons. They channeled their grief into a new sense of purpose, ensuring that their son's legacy would be one of hope and help for others. Alex Preston's documentary, The Eye on the Mountain, was released the following year to critical acclaim and widespread public attention. It was a powerful and sensitive film, a masterclass in true crime storytelling that avoided sensationalism and focused on the human element of the tragedy. The film brought renewed attention to the issue of cold cases and highlighted the transformative potential of drone technology in search and rescue operations. It won numerous awards, but for Alex, the greatest reward was the knowledge that he had helped to bring a measure of peace to a family that had endured so much pain. The Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness remains a place of breathtaking and untamed beauty. Hikers still flock to its trails, and scout troops still camp beneath its starry skies. The story of Michael Carver has become a part of the local lore, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires, a reminder of the respect that the wilderness demands. The trail to Glacier Lake is now marked with a small bronze plaque in Mikey's memory, a simple, understated tribute to the boy who vanished there so many years ago. It serves as a silent testament to the fragility of life and the enduring power of a parent's love. Life, for Tom and Sarah Carver, would never be the same. A part of them would forever be lost in the high, lonely mountains where their son took his last breath. But they had found a way to move forward, to carry their grief not as a crushing burden, but as a part of who they were. They had faced the unimaginable, endured the unendurable, and had emerged from the long, dark night of their sorrow with a quiet strength and a renewed sense of purpose. The long goodbye to their son was not an ending, but a transformation, testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable loss. The final scene of Alex's documentary is not of the grave, nor of the grim evidence found in Blackwood's cellar. It is a shot taken by the drone, soaring high above the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. The camera pans slowly across the majestic, sun-drenched peaks, the vast, green canopy of the forest stretching out to the horizon. It is a view of profound peace and timeless beauty. It is the world as Mikey saw it in his final moments, a world of wonder and adventure. And in that final breathtaking image, there is a sense of release, a feeling that the young boy's spirit is finally free, soaring with the eagles in the vast, open sky. The story of Michael Carver is a tragedy, a stark and brutal reminder of the darkness that can exist in the human heart. But it is also a story of hope, of the unwavering power of a family's love, and of the incredible potential of technology to shine a light into the darkest of corners. It is a story that reminds us that even after the longest and most silent of nights, the sun will eventually rise, and the truth, however painful, has the power to set us free. The echoes in the valley have faded, replaced by the quiet, enduring whisper of a memory, a story that will now be told, and a boy who will never be forgotten.